Hey everyone, before we start the show, I just want to get some plugs out of the way. If you enjoy this podcast and you're into wrestling, check out the Nerds and Marks podcast or Marty and Sarah Love Wrestling. If you're not getting your fill on movie and entertainment discussion, then check out the Entertainment Buffet podcast. If you want to dive into the world of video games, I highly recommend the Darkcast by my friends over at darkstation.com. Listen to them cover important topics and interview men and women from all over the industry. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Hello everyone and welcome to Shelved. It's been a little while since we covered an actual movie episode. Recently I put up the Black Widow movie pitch, which I was kind of unhappy with that episode. It was way too short. I didn't go anywhere near in depth as I wanted to, so that will be revisited. So think of that as like a preview of the Pitch a Movie feature. But today we're actually going to talk about a movie, and it's not a script per se. It is something a little different. So one of my all-time favorite movies is Robocop, the original Robocop from the 1980s. I think it's actually 88 when the year I was born. 87. So it actually came out a year before I was born. Now, Robocop is one of my all-time favorite movies. I love everything about it. It was a movie I saw maybe way too much as a kid. I have very distinct memories of, we had a local video rental store in our town, and I think you can rent movies for like $1.50 or something. And we lived like 3 blocks away from it. So I remember, and this had to have been when I was about 5, just walking by myself to the store and renting Robocop, and no one batted an eye. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked where my parents were. Granted, it was a very small town and people knew me and my family, so maybe they just knew, Jeremy's parents are okay with this. But yeah, I would rent Robocop frequently. And I saw it all the time as a kid. I own it on Blu-ray now. It's a movie I love watching. Just everything about it. I loved specifically the character and the designs of like the robots and like Ed 209 and stuff like that. I don't know. It stuck with me. I don't know why a lot of people in my generation, we find it as kids, and for some reason, even though it's a very violent, hard R-rated action movie, it spoke to us as kids, and it's still one of my favorite movies today. And weirdly enough, I remember Robocop 3 is one of the earliest movies I remember seeing in theaters. I think Robocop 3 was like 92, 93. According to my mom, the first movie I ever saw in theaters was Beauty and the Beast. I assume that's true. I don't know why she would have lied to me. But I don't remember that. I remember seeing Robocop 3 in the theater. So, and then Bad Boys is like the next one I remember, which is like 95. I saw a lot of like R-rated movies in the theater because Robocop 3 was actually PG-13. That's a whole different story. But I love all of the Robocop movies. I even love I don't love the remake. I should say I like the remake. It was the movie that broke me on like hating on remakes. Like, they shouldn't remake this movie. Like the Robocop remake, it's a different thing, and I think it's fine. I think it's still entertaining. It loses all of the stuff that made the original special, and it just is boiled down to an action movie, where the first one had a lot of politics and satire, and they try to go for some of that in the remake, and they just don't get it. But I think, as good as Robocop is, I think there is an argument to be made that Robocop 2 is the best Robocop movie. That is my opinion. I know it is not a popular one. I admit the first one is probably the better movie, but I just have always loved Robocop 2. And it wasn't until years later I found out that Robocop 2 and Robocop 3 actually were written by Frank Miller, the famous comic book writer who's most known for Batman Year One and Batman The Dark Knight Returns and just Sin City. He's worked on so many amazing classic comics, and he was the writer of Robocop 2. Now, he wasn't the only writer, and the story goes that he wrote a script that was deemed unfilmable. And so they brought in a guy to rewrite Robocop 2, and it became the movie it is today, using some of the elements from Frank Miller's script and then rewriting it into a more cohesive movie. Now, what we are going to be talking about today is Frank Miller's original script, which what happened is, this isn't actually a script that I read. Years later, they took Frank Miller's script and adapted it into a comic book. So I read the comic book, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So basically what this is Frank Miller's movie script that they said was unfilmable. They're like, oh, why don't we just make it a comic? So it's a way to mix it up a little bit. You know, we're still talking about a movie that was very different and was never made, but it just happened to be released in a comic book form. And there are actually a lot of movies that this has happened to. Kevin Smith, I think, has written at least 3 of them. With he did a Green Hornet, he did a $6 Million Man, and I want to say there was another one. But there are multiple comic books out there that are based on unproduced movies. And I think we will try to look at all of those. I'm still trying to get my hands on some of them. But Frank Miller's Robocop seemed like a good place to start, because as far as I know, this is the first one that it's ever happened with. I have always said for years I wish they would do this with the Tim Burton Batman franchise. Like, they were going to do a movie after Batman and Robin called Batman Unchained. It also, I think, goes by Batman Triumphant or something like that. And it was going to have like Nicolas Cage as the Scarecrow. And I think I've been trying to track down any of that stuff. I do believe there was a form of that script put out as a book that I am trying to get my hands on. But I wish they would kind of continue that franchise in the comic books. I mean, the same way I wish they would continue the Nolan Batman in comics. But yeah, so Robocop 2. As I said, I think Robocop 2 is my favorite of the Robocop movies because I love the idea of them creating another Robocop and them having to fight. I think the stop motion animation and the design of Robocop 2 in the movie is awesome. I love the story and the fact that Robocop 2 is this like crazed drug dealer's brain put into this giant robot body. And I love the idea of Nuke, and just like one thing that's always stuck with me with the Robocop franchise is the sound design. Like, the sounds I will always remember forever are the sounds of like Murphy turning his head and moving his arms, and the sound his feet makes when he walks, just that cha-chung, cha-chung as he walks. Like, I love that. But another one is always the sound of like the Nuke when they put it in their neck and it just does that crazy sound effect. I'd love to know what that is. Like, talk to the Foley artist or something. But yeah, so one thing to notice about this comic when I first started reading it, and what I learned is that not only did this script inspire large chunks of Robocop 2, it actually inspired a lot of Robocop 3, because as I read this, I noticed that it's a kind of like both of those movies smashed together in one story. And I did a little more research, and Frank Miller was the writer on Robocop 3 as well, alongside somebody else. He had a co-writer, and he was very unhappy with the project, and it kind of pushed him out of Hollywood until they made Sin City. And he said, which I believe he had part in directing Sin City, or he had, Robert Rodriguez gave him more control over the project. Because he said, I'm trying to remember the quote, but basically that he doesn't want to be the writer. He wants to be the director, because a script is just a fire hydrant and it has a whole line of dogs just waiting, basically, to come piss on your fucking ideas. And yeah, so Frank Miller kind of out of movies for a while until he came and gave us Sin City, which I love. Is a fantastic movie. Then he did The Spirit, and I just try to forget about that. Okay, so the opening of the script. The first issue is kind of like the openings of Robocop 2 and 3 smashed together. Like we have the police on strike, which was a big part of RoboCop 2. And the parts of 3 that I talk about are the little girl running out of the buildings as they're getting demolished. So if you remember the plot of RoboCop 2 in the movie, it was they were bankrupting Detroit, so OCP could basically buy it out and then turn it into like a brand new city and just basically demolish everything and, you know, fuck everybody who lived there and blah, blah, blah. So there's a little bit of that in here. But basically they're demolishing buildings and this little girl's running and then she gets kidnapped. And then RoboCop comes to save her. And if you remember the opening of RoboCop 2, it is RoboCop or Murphy and Lewis raiding a nuke factory, and they have like a bunch of kids there. It's like I guess it's just a kid. There's a kid there as they raid a nuke factory. So it's kind of like both of these put together, because then what happens is this leads RoboCop to stopping like a prostitution ring, like a child prostitution ring. One thing to note about Frank Miller is if not kept in check, he is one of the darkest writers in existence. Like he just must be a very interesting man, because a lot of his writing, it's almost too dark for me, and I like some dark stuff. He was actually at a convention here last year in Chicago called C2E2, which is basically like Chicago Comic-Con. And he was there, and he could have got his autograph, but it was $100, and so was Stan Lee's, who was there, and I would rather have gotten Stan Lee's, so I went in for Stan, did not get to see Frank Miller, although I kind of saw him like through some curtains, but I didn't go for the autograph. So yeah, that's kind of the first issue, is them, you know, we established and I think the comic is 9 issues altogether. So the first issue is just establishing RoboCop. And we see Lewis, and we see the cops are on strike, and RoboCop is still out there. We go into issue 2, and we meet the psychiatrist character. If you remember in RoboCop 2, there is a psychiatrist who is kind of behind the RoboCop 2 project and finding the brain. She's the one that selects Kane, because if you remember, they try to use a bunch of different people, and it all goes wrong, which that scene is also in this comic. I think it comes a little later, though. But in this, we established that she was like a famous TV psychiatrist, and she basically sold out to OCP for money. We also find out that Murphy has been on the streets for 76 hours straight, and he's all beat up because OCP just needs the publicity of like, look at this great thing we did. We gave you RoboCop. And this, we also get the rehabilitation team from RoboCop 3. If you remember RoboCop 3, the group of soldiers led by the guy who looks like, what the fuck is his name from The Loser? Steve Martin. I always thought he looked like Steve Martin. He's got the white hair and everything. In this, it's a little different. Like, there's no like main guy on the rehabilitation team. They're not like the main villains. Like, they're just kind of always there and fucking shit up. And clearly, right from the beginning, they're just terrible and already kind of at war with the cops. Like, as soon as they get introduced, which the rehabilitation team was something I actually liked from RoboCop 3, and it makes sense because it's one of the things that was kept over from the Frank Miller script. And already early on, so we get Murphy coming in from the streets, and he's all beat up. And right away, the psychiatrist is talking about adding in new directives for him. Basically, they want to sabotage RoboCop so they can justify a RoboCop 2. So this is right afterwards. They show their attempts at all the RoboCop 2, which is kind of the same stuff, like scientists getting shot, them killing themselves because the brains just can't take it, which is one of the best scenes in RoboCop 2, and one of the reasons why, to me, it's one of my favorite movies. But basically, they want a RoboCop with no moral compass. They think, is that the right phrase? Moral compass? I don't know. Basically, because like Murphy won't force people out of their homes and stuff like that and play ball with OCP. They're like, we need a RoboCop who will just blindly follow orders. Because that was like a big part of the original RoboCop, which is something I noticed watching it as an adult. Is there's a lot of, you know, is he a real person? Is he a robot? And some of that does carry over into the second film as well, but not really in the comic. In the comic, it's basically just like, hey, look, we already did that in the first one. We know that he is, like, he sees himself as a human, as a person. So they don't really fuck with that too much. So we see that Lewis sees some scared people robbing a gun shop, and she tries to politely send them home. when one of the rehabilitation cops shows up and just murders all of them and like almost kills her. So this is kind of our setup of the rehabs, as they're called. They're just kind of running the town on their own. And I believe OCP is the one that sets in the rehabs. I don't remember if that's how it was in the third movie. I believe that's how it was. It's been a while since I've seen Robocop 3. I've actually seen the TV show more recently than I've seen the third movie. So, which if you haven't seen the fucking TV show, give that a gander. It was on Amazon Prime last I saw. Chances are it's not free there at the moment, but oh, is that a looker? Yeah, so Robocop gets blown up and taken down by some crazy rehab officer who they want to use as Robocop 2. So they kind of set it up as a plan to show like it's like a hostage situation, and they send in the rehabs and they send in Murphy. But it's all just kind of used as a setup to get this rehab dude taken down because the psychiatrist wants to use his brain. And that's the difference. In this script, there is no Nuke. There is no Kane. And I think it's worse off for it because those were kind of some of the more interesting parts of the second film. I'm looking at my notes here. He's the same commercial of the guy who has the slow internet. Some of the... So if you remember in the movie... There are the commercials and the satirical look at the world in RoboCop, and some of that is ripped right out of this comic. Like they have a commercial talking about a guy who like, oh, I lost my company a bunch of money, you know, they're going bankrupt, and then he just like shoots himself, and it's super fucking dark, and then it pops up like an ad for slow internet. Is like it kills, and so that some of that stuff is ripped right out of the comic. It's more interesting movie because it plays on the man. Okay, so RoboCop 2 has a scene where he's like watching his wife in the early parts of the movie, and then she kind of it's almost as if she sneaks into the police station and like comes and talks to him, and he's just like, look, your husband's dead. They put this face on me in honor to him. But in this, they bring her in as kind of like therapy for RoboCop, which I think is more interesting in the movie because it does play on that man versus machine angle. But in this, they just bring her in to just kind of like fuck him up, fuck with his head a little bit. And this is when they load him up with all of the directives. Like if you remember the movie, they give him like originally he had the 4 directives, and then in this one they add in a bunch of directives, and he's basically he can't function because he has too much shit going on in his brain. And a lot of these scenes are just like the movie. They have the fire hydrant scene where he lectures the kids, and then they spray paint on them. The one thing that I thought was kind of crazy is so we get Lewis kind of is doing her own thing throughout the script. There's not a lot of RoboCop and Lewis working together, which is in the RoboCop movies. I always really liked their relationship. I thought that was always an interesting angle, even up to the point where she died in RoboCop 3, which I was always kind of waiting for that in this script, but it never actually happens. Spoiler, she doesn't die. So Anne actually goes to see the captain, who, you know, in the first 2 movies, actually, I don't remember if he's in the third movie. I would assume he is. The black, like, tough police captain. He's always yelling and shit. And this one, he actually dies. So Anne goes to see him and sees that he's leaving town. And they know that the rehabs are basically just mercenaries. And then he gets sniped by one of the rehab guys. And Anne runs after the guy, which turns into a knife fight that she wins, which is pretty good. There is some good action in the comic. One thing that is kind of annoying is I don't know when this comic was written, but it does not treat Lewis very well from an art standpoint. Like, she is constantly getting her clothes blown off and is just in her bra and underwear all the time. And it's just very early 90s, late 80s, like, oh, look at this sexy chick. And it just, like, reading it now, it just feels like, it's just so many groans as I was reading it. And it's pretty common for Frank Miller and whoever he's working with. You can see a lot of that kind of stuff in his art and even in his writing. It's why Frank Miller has never honestly been one of my favorite comic writers, which is, I know, blasphemy in the world of comic books, but he's written some stuff I really love. Batman Year One is one of the greatest Batman books of all time. Dark Knight Returns is, held up there as one of the best, although it is not my favorite. Sin City, I really love Sin City, but there's a lot of that in Sin City as well. So we do get another scene, which I think is from Robocop 3, where Lewis runs to a donut shop, and it's a rehab guy chasing her. And instead of there's the scene in, I think, Robocop 3 where a guy goes into a donut shop to rob it, and it turns out everybody in the donut shop is a cop, and they all turn and point guns at him. And this scene happens as well, except it's a rehab guy. So this is kind of really setting off the war between the cops and the rehab. Of course, Robocop gets blamed for killing the captain, though, because the whole thing is they're trying to show that he is going crazy. He's losing control, and that's why we need this new Robocop. We also get another commercial that gets ripped straight out into the movie, which is the car alarm system that bolts the guy in with the the seatbelt and electrocutes him, which I always remembered and is really funny. But yeah, there's another one ripped right out of the comic. So in between these scenes, we get little hints of the rehab guy getting turned into Robocop 2. Sorry, I'm laughing just remembering where this ends up going. This little section of the comic gets pretty convoluted. There were multiple times where I was kind of losing, like, not really sure what the pacing of this was supposed to be, how we get from A to B. But basically we just kind of cut to Robocop patrolling a train station, and Robocop 2 shows up, which Robocop 2 looks nothing like he does in the movie. He's just drawn as this big hulking monster. Like, he's closer to, like, the Hulkbuster armor in the Marvel movies, but, like, a lot taller and longer limbs, but still kind of stocky the way that looks, and a little bit of a rounder head. And inside the head is, like, a screen, and you can see the face of the rehab guy that they used. And he had, like, a phrase he would say. And the rehab guy, like, when they give him a name, but it's not really important. So I don't remember it. It apparently didn't take a note on it. He had, like, a phrase or something he would always say or do. So it's how Robocop knows that this giant robot is that dude who he fought earlier when they had the hostage situation. That was a setup, because basically, like, Robocop was going in to solve the hostage situation, and then, did I just say that really fucking weird? Situation. And the rehab guy just, like, busts in and just shoots everybody, and the hostage dies and kills the fucking dude. Yeah, so, and he's almost kind of played mentally challenged, it seems like. Like, they always show him and he looks real weird. It's almost like cartoony and comical, the way he's, like, got his tongue out all the time and stuff like that. But this is kind of their first meeting as the Robocops, and they fuck each other up. Like, they just start fighting inside the train station. They fight into the subway line where they have fuck up the tracks, and a train hits the big robot, and Robocop gets fucked up. And then we get a kind of cut scene here where they cut in a commercial again, where we get, it's a commercial for hemorrhoid suppositories, but it has murder in it because that's the way Frank Miller is. And, you know, they establish it in Robocop, the satirical element of this world, but it's literally like they're talking about suppositories, and they're like, an Afghani looking terrorist shows up and dude just shoots him down. It was kind of ridiculous to kind of put that there, but it's usually like, oh, at the end of an issue, at the beginning of an issue, we get, like, some of that satirical commercial stuff. And then we get, like, things kind of go a little overboard as, like, literally nuclear winter is happening. Like, we see on one of the news posts. They're like, oh, in some country today, which I don't remember what country it is, but basically they're just like, oh yeah, they accidentally set off a nuclear bomb, and they're like, oh yeah, the world might be experiencing nuclear winter, and like just this whole section of the comic, I feel like it was just getting to be too much. Like we know how the world of RoboCop is, due to the first movie, and it's just like taking it 10 steps too far. And it all kind of happens in just this 1 or 2 issues, like here towards the end of the book. It's part of... It's things I have problems with. Like, as I was, like, kind of reading the comic, I was actually really enjoying it. Like, I could see why they didn't film it. I don't know about unfilmable. Granted, maybe it was written different in the script form that when it got translated to the comic book. Obviously, some of the action scenes are a little crazier than what's in any of the movies, but honestly, I feel like they could have rewritten some of those action scenes and it would have been fine. But granted, I think it's better that we got the rewrite that we did because I think the movie is much better. Kong, that was the guy's name. The rehab dude's name is Kong. I knew I had that written somewhere. Okay, but so... Yeah, we're there fighting in the subway, and then we get these cuts with the commercials and the news, and then we cut back and we see there's a fucking messed up scene here where we literally see RoboCop with no arms. Like, he's on the ground, he had no arms because he got fucked up from when the train hit them, and he kind of like fell down deep into the subway, and there was like some sewers underground. They show him walking around where some homeless people are, and RoboCop 2 goes back to OCP. But then like we cut literally to RoboCop walking through the sewers, and he has both of his arms on, and he couldn't have fixed them. He was by himself. We saw him on the ground with no arms, and then all of a sudden he's just walking, and he's beat up like throughout most of this comic, like the art style, which I'm not a big fan of the art overall. It's very dirty. It's very Mad Magazine-esque. I don't know who the artist is. I don't have the comic in front of me. And even if I did, I obviously wouldn't recognize the art, but that's what it feels like. It feels very gross. Like all the faces look very pimply, and I'm just not a big fan, except for Lewis, of course, who is drawn to be like, ooh, look at this sexy woman, as I was saying before. But it's just not... I don't know. The art doesn't do it for me. It's very muddled. Literally, there are arrows pointing you to panels on certain pages because it is so muddled, and it doesn't feel like it's done in a artistic way to hey, this is my artistic expression. It's like, oh no, we just had a lot we needed to fit on the page, so here's this jumbled mess, and you figure it out. We'll give you some arrows to help you. But yeah, I don't know. So reading the comic eventually became like I was kind of blazing through it. But this kind of into the third act or the end of the second act, I guess, is kind of a slog. Like, I just had trouble with it. Mostly the art and the story gets a little ridiculous and then kind of brings it back down to reality a little bit. Because we're getting into the end here, and it's pretty bad what happens. So they're back at OCP, and the psychiatrists, they're basically trying to wipe Kong's personality out of RoboCop 2, and they're basically going to rewrite his personality, except she has a secret disc, so she's kind of up to something. One thing that changes in this is the psychiatrist is way more of like a villain. Like, she is kind of the main villain of this, versus we had the old man from OCP in the first 2 movies. He is nowhere to be seen in this. I think he has like a short mention and appearance at the beginning. Otherwise, we never see him again. Like, OCP was always the real villain of the RoboCop films, and there were figureheads in all of the movies that would kind of stand in to be the main bad guy that somebody would have to get shot at the end. In some cases with a million squibs when Ed 209 is just unloading on a guy. And if I can take a sidebar, I love squibs in an action movie. It is one thing I want more than anything, is to be squibbed in a movie, which, if you don't know what a squib is, when you watch an older action movie, something like RoboCop, for example, when somebody gets shot, and their chest explodes and blood comes out. That's a squib. A squib is a little explosive device underneath a blood packet that, explodes and it shoots out the blood to make it look like a real gunshot. It was something that was very much bothering me in action movies for a long time. Like, say, early 2000s, mid 2000s. CG. That's where blood comes from now. Like, you still get squibs in movies from time to time, depending on the production. But most times, blood and everything now is done with CG. And it's very noticeable to me. It often just looks like a mist or a powder. Like, it's getting better now, but in the early days it was really rough. And it's one of the things that made me like Bad Boys 2 so much, is it was one of the first big action movies that brought back squibs. Like, you watch Bad Boys 2 and there are squibs all over that fucking movie. Like, people are getting ripped to shreds. And a perfect example is the scene in Robocop where they're showing Ed 209 in the building, and he, they turn him on. He's like, "Put down the weapon. You have 5 seconds to comply." And then they try to shut him off, and it doesn't work. And the guy gets lit up in the office building, which is just a hilarious moment and one of my favorite moments of the movie. And even in the extended cut, there's an even longer. He gets thrown on the model, and then Ed 209 keeps shooting, and he's just exploding blood everywhere. Those are all squibs, and Paul Verhoeven uses them very well in Robocop. I think, just to point out, I believe Robocop 2 was directed by Irvin Kershner, who, if you don't know who that, it was Irvin Kershner, which, if you don't know what other movies he's directed, he did a little movie called James Bond Never Say Never Again, but he also did The Empire Strikes Back, my all-time favorite movie. So he did 2 movies that are very much some of my all-time favorite movies, Robocop 2 and Star Wars. Second one, Empire Strikes Back. 5th one, whatever. And then Never Say Never Again, I think, is an underrated James Bond movie because it's not part of the official canon. That was the one where I guess it was Sony or somebody else. They had the rights. I believe we talked about this in another podcast, so I'm not going to go too much into that. But basically, they made their own standalone Bond movie, and they brought back Sean Connery, and Irvin Kershner directed that. And most people write it off and shit on it, but I actually really love it. I think Never Say Never Again is a great Bond movie. Okay, so moving into the third act of the Robocop script, which I think is actually some of the strongest stuff. I really like the beginning and the end. The middle is not for me. It gets a little fucked up and weird there. So we cut to, as I said, they're trying to wipe Kong's personality out of Robocop 2 when Murphy breaks into OCP. And at this point, he's still kind of loaded up with those directives, even though they haven't played a part in the plot at all at this point. But he wipes his programming. So now he has no directives, and he is just himself. But what really happens here is the doctor, the disc that she was putting into Robocop 2, it was actually her personality, and her personality gets overwritten into Robocop 2. And that's when they start fighting. So, that's kind of crazy and kind of cool. And, she gets totally fucked up and burned. As she's doing it, she's kind of giving a speech oh, I'm going to live forever. But in reality, she's dying, and it's a copy of her personality that's living on in this robot. So it's kind of a fucked up, twisted thing when you think about it. And it's interesting. In the movie, it was just Kane, and they gave you a reason for Robocop and Kane to hate, or I keep calling him Robocop, just say Murphy. They gave you a reason for Murphy and Kane to hate each other and want to take each other down. And Murphy walking in on the scene in the warehouse, which, let me just say, that scene as a child, legitimately scared me. When they're having the drug deal or not the drug deal, it's when the mayor is coming in. They're trying to offer him money to help save the city. And then Robocop 2 comes in, and it's all dark and is taking everyone down. It's fucking awesome. And that scene it just fucking scared me as a kid. It felt like a horror movie. I loved Robocop 2, but that giant robot felt like a movie monster. The way people were afraid of Dracula and shit like that. That's how I felt about Kane and Robocop 2. He's just this awesome, huge fucking robot, and he scared me. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, he's fucking awesome. But there was a while like, oh, I loved watching Robocop 2, but there was a little bit where like, oh, I might cover my eyes a little bit. Granted, as I said, I was a kid, way too young to be watching that movie. So we get we see the cops at the station, and the rehabs are outside, and they got them pinned down, and they're basically just taking them out, like shooting through the windows, just kind of fucking with the cops until Robocop shows up and just takes them all out. And I don't even remember how they get to that. There seems to be some stuff missing, like this, because the last time we see Lewis is that I remember. It's been a little while since I read this, so I may be forgetting some stuff. But they show Lewis, and after she's with the captain and he gets killed, and then it feels like it just cuts to this. And she's got all these people in the police station, and they're pinned down. And then Robocop basically shows up and kills all of the rehabs, and that's pretty much the end of their story. And then this is when Robocop 2 shows up, and next door, there's a big-ass construction site. So this leads into the final battle. Murphy is fighting the psychiatrist as Robocop 2 in the construction site, and he's just getting fucked up. I mean, they really make this robot to be huge, and like even bigger than what Kane was in Robocop 2. And Murphy, obviously being as flimsy as he is, he just can't stand up to it. There's one point where she's like revealing a weakness where she has fluid in like the arms, and he shoots it. And like what it was is like she has a flamethrower, so she's burning Murphy, but he shoots the fuel in the arms, and then they hit her with a rocket, and so she gets caught on fire and weakened, and the rocket is what does her in. But it's like crazy. Like it's actually a really good final battle. It's hard, to describe. It's basically just them fucking each other up at construction site, throwing each other into I-beams, pulling stuff down on each other. It would make a really good like final act fight in a movie. I think what happens in RoboCop 2 is better. Like I love the ending of that movie and the final fight with Kane and them going off the top of the building into the subway. And, again, there are some moments that feel similar to the comic. I actually thought I would see more of what was in the movie in the comic, but it doesn't actually go that way. But yeah, so the end, it actually puts RoboCop in an interesting place. Because if you remember, he was completely erased from his directives. Now he is his own man. He can do whatever he wants. We get a little epilogue. It's just like, well, before that, actually, Murphy kisses Lewis. And then, which is something I never really saw with them in the movie. Like, I never saw a Murphy-Lewis relationship. That just never seemed like something that was gonna happen. Or never anything that was hinted at. But in the comic, they, like, share a kiss. And it doesn't... I don't know, it doesn't feel earned, because as I said, they never spend any time together. It's a problem when you have these two main characters, and if you remember the other movies, they spend a lot of time together. They're always working together. In this, they spend 90% of the script not even in the same area. So that is a huge lost opportunity, I would say, because I think that relationship is important in the movies and, is a lot better than what's portrayed in the comic. But it leaves the franchise in an interesting place if this was the way they had gone. Because basically what happens is, like, the city starts to put itself back together again. OCP is getting in trouble for the RoboCop 2 business. They got horrible PR going on. Shit is obviously still bad in the city because it's Detroit and it's RoboCop, and that's just how it works. But basically, Murphy, he's gone, and he's just out on the streets basically being a vigilante. Like, he has just become Batman. They show, like, he has a police car, and he's kind of living with the homeless people. If you think of, like, Spawn or something where he's living with homeless people. And, yeah, it's just like, they get a call, and it's like, I gotta go. And it's just Murphy racing off, and he is just the vigilante of Detroit. So what do I think? I think it's okay. It's one of the better written Frank Miller stories that I actually enjoy. It has its bad moments. It has its good moments. It pulls the things I very much enjoy from RoboCop 2 and 3. And it was interesting. It was interesting to read it as, this was something that was passed around in the late 80s, early 90s. RoboCop came out in 87. RoboCop 2 came out in 90. So there wasn't a ton of time in between the films. And it's weird to think that this was a thing that existed between then. And I recommend reading it. If you're a RoboCop fan, that is. If you're listening to this and you're not a RoboCop fan, I don't know why you're listening to this. But I really love RoboCop. I watched the cartoon. I had the toys. I am in the market for an Ed 209 figure that I think would be cool to put on my printer at work. And like I said, I even like the remake just because to me it is more RoboCop. And so if you're a RoboCop fan, I recommend reading this. It feels like fan fiction, but it's interesting because it is the official source. I honestly didn't even know Frank Miller wrote RoboCop 2 and 3 until I looked into this comic and was reading it and checking it out. I had no idea, and I think it's okay. It has problems. The characters feel a little thin. The plot is good, but it does feel like a bit of a mess, and you can honestly see how they were able to split it into two movies because they were able to take two of these elements, like the idea of another robotic cop and the stuff with the rehabs, and you see how that can easily be split into two movies. And the rehab stuff is why I like RoboCop 3. The PG-13 rating holds that movie back. The recasting of actors holds that movie back. I haven't seen it in so long. I would love to rewatch it just to see if I do enjoy it more. But in the version of the rehabs is way better in the movie. I don't like this version at all, where basically they're just mercenaries. They're just crazy people. They're evil for the sake of evil. They're not really given a face or a character to really latch on to, so there's not a lot to go off with the rehabs in the comic. So what they did in the movie is actually better. I don't know how people feel about that angle in the movie. I know everybody hates RoboCop 3, but I don't know if that has anything to do with why they hate it. Maybe it's probably more jetpack and, hey, let's put a new gun on his arm so we can sell toys. Which I want to say, I think that actually happens in the script. I think there is a moment where he takes off his arm and puts on a weapon there, but I think it's a very brief moment used only once, versus in that movie, I think they do it multiple times. But to me, that honestly makes sense. That's something you would do with a robot who could swap out limbs and stuff. I don't know. Makes sense to me. But, I feel like I'm just stretching at this point. I guess that's all I really have for RoboCop. I recommend reading it. If you can get your hands on it, it's pretty easy to find. You can get it on Comixology if you do digital comics, or it's on Amazon. It's just simply known as Frank Miller's RoboCop, and I recommend it. Check it out. I pretty much gave you the rundown, but there are things about reading it that bring it down for me, just in the sense of the way Frank Miller writes and views reality, I guess. And the art is really not for me. It's some of my least favorite comic art, but it's not terrible. So, I guess that is what it is. But yeah, so that's going to be it for RoboCop 2 in today's episode. It's the RoboCop that could have been, but instead it became two movies, and that's also an interesting aspect as well. To think that this became hey, I don't know if that's anything we've ever really touched on a script before. I think when we did Star Wars, George Lucas's rough draft eventually became 3 movies and then 6 movies, even though they didn't really touch on any of that time period. But yeah, so that's something that we've not really addressed, really. That a script can become multiple movies. How about that? But that'll be it for today's episode. Done talking about RoboCop. Coming up, we still have a Star Wars commentary track. Hoping to record that this weekend. Hopefully, while you're listening to this, maybe I'm sitting down to watch some Return of the Jedi with the wife, and hopefully we'll get that done. Also, be sure to check us out on our social medias at the Twitter and Instagram at Shelved Podcast. And be sure, I feel like I haven't been mentioning this enough, and I actually checked recently, and it did look like we had a new iTunes review. Be sure to leave us an iTunes review. So I might have read this one before, but I always like to read the iTunes reviews. It's from October of last year. So I thought I would just read this just in case I haven't already. If I have, sorry for reading it twice. But this is from Zach71296, headline Behind the Scenes. And it says, I love this show. It's really interesting to see what could have been with some of your favorite movies and some you've never heard of. I can't wait to see what scripts the show will cover next. If you love the movies, you'll love this show. And 5 stars. So thanks, Zach. That brings us to 15 reviews. Not very many. We need more reviews, guys. But we are currently still a 5-star show on iTunes. So thanks for listening to this 5-star podcast with just me. This has got to be irritating everybody at this point. It'll be a breath of fresh air to do the Star Wars commentary just to hear another voice. And it's a nice voice, if I do say so myself. So yeah, check out the social medias. Looking to do a live episode this weekend. So this is coming out on Friday. Looking to do at some point, like Saturday or Sunday, a live stream on Instagram. So be sure to look us up on Instagram at Shelved Podcast. I might do it on Twitter at the same time as well. And I want to do some Q&A. So bring your Q's. I'll bring whatever answers I can give you. I was going to say bring some A's. That sounded stupid. But yeah, so I want to do that. It's been 1 year since we launched the show. January 16th was our 1 year, and I, put out a message on Twitter and everything, but I just want to thank everybody that has been listening, that has been following along, that talks to me on Twitter and Instagram, and it's because of you guys that I still do this. I've always said I would continue to do the show if only one person was downloading each week. But luckily, I've been able to build a nice, steady audience that I hope keeps growing. But I love everybody that's been listening. I love that you guys like the show and want to listen to the show. And I know we get some new listeners every now and then. I love seeing the days where somebody has apparently downloaded every single episode. So for everybody who's a new listener, thank you. And I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you don't delete everything after the first one because you're like, oh, fuck this. Because, hey, I'll be the first to say, our first episodes are pretty rough. Like they got better, trust me. But yeah, so I just want to thank everybody. I haven't got a chance to do that on the podcast yet, but it's been 1 year and it's crazy. It's something I've always wanted to do, and I couldn't believe it when I launched it that I was doing it. And it's so simple. Everybody should have a podcast. Like everybody should just do it. You can do it on your phone and post it to YouTube. You can do whatever you want. Like, it's fun to be able to sit here and get these thoughts off my head and into the airwaves, and so everybody can listen to me ramble, which is what I'm doing now. But I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. So I very much appreciate it, and would very much appreciate if you go leave that iTunes review. You can do it just right on your phone. I know some people listen on YouTube. Apparently we actually get a lot of listeners on our Tumblr. So thank you for listening on Tumblr. Kind of haven't really been up. I used to post the scripts there, but it seemed like nobody really wanted them. So if you honestly do want scripts, I can't link the comic book, obviously, but if you want the scripts posted to the Tumblr, let me know, and I'll keep posting that there. But yeah, so thank everybody for listening, and be sure to check back in the next few weeks. We got the Star Wars commentary coming. We have Devil May Cry is the next script I will be discussing. Again, probably solo. But I already know some of the scripts I want to cover this year. We have a new Predator movie coming this year, and I have a Predator script waiting. We got a Star Wars movie in May. I have a Star Wars related script I want to cover. So there's just a little preview of some of the stuff coming this year. But be sure to check back this weekend on the social media for the live episode, and I will probably post that immediately. It'll be like a bonus episode. Be sure to check back on Monday for our mini episode and see what our episode for next weekend's going to be. But that's going to be it for today, and thanks for listening.